Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Please do not adjust your television. The following program is brought to you in beautiful black and white.
A good Sunday morning to all you cowpokes, and Happy New Year 1949. Your weather forecast for January 2nd calls for partly cloudy skies, with highs in the 30s, and the possibility of some snow flurries in the mountains. Safe travels, partners.
On Sunday afternoon, January 2nd, 1949, an unexpected Arctic cold front swept down from Canada and collided with heavy, moisture-laden air from the south. A massive multi-state winter weather event was born. Portions of Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas were pummeled by heavy snow, unrelenting winds, and sub-zero temperatures. The blizzard didn't let up until the following Wednesday, but this was just the beginning. Like the Dust Bowl storms of the 30s, with their ominous walls of black clouds, the 1949 blizzards raged white for nearly 2 months. The winds seldom ceased their incessant howl. Temperatures bottomed out the mercury in thermometers. Although much of Wyoming was blasted by the storm, it was the state's eastern and southeastern counties that took the brunt of the beating. Wind gusts of over 80 miles per hour in some places created drifts 20 to 30 feet high, yet left the ground completely bare in other areas. The storm blanketed 3,300 miles of Wyoming roads. All auto, bus, rail, and air traffic came to a halt. Thousands of travelers were stranded. Ranches, farms, and entire communities became islands in a sea of white. Livestock and wildlife suffered and died. 17 people in Wyoming perished. It was the worst sustained winter weather event the Upper Plains states have ever experienced. Dubbed the Great White Death and the Storm of the Century, this was the blizzard of 1949.
No, January 1st, 1949 was a nice day, and really, for winter time, it was a very nice day. And so was the early part of January 2nd. I lived just 50 miles east of Cheyenne, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon is when the wind came up and the snow started falling, and we didn't see sunshine until the morning of the 5th of January.
I think that was one of the more extraordinary things about the blizzard of 1949 was that it started unexpectedly. It brought with it high winds and deep snow, and it lasted much, much longer than most winter storms. And so it goes down in Wyoming history as one of those once-in-a-generation or once-in-a-century events because it combined all of those qualities of surprise and furiosity that come with blizzards.
It caught people by surprise. Even the U.S. Weather Bureau experts didn't see it coming. They were predicting possible snow flurries.
In 1949, weather reports simply weren't as accurate as they are today. Satellites and Doppler radar, computer models, and other high-tech tools simply didn't exist.
1949 weather forecasting was very simple in comparison to what we do today. They would likely have a staff of about 4 to 6 people that were taking observations, weather observations at specific sites across the country. They were using those observations to get some sort of an idea of what the prediction and what the weather would be going forward. But you can see here on the 1st, you start to see this deep trough of low pressure developing across the northern Rocky Mountain states. We'll continue forward in time, and you can see it really takes shape and deepens across the four corners into the day on Monday. And this would be about when the conditions were the worst. Move forward into Tuesday. Surf, you see this big low pressure still really close to the area, even 48 and 60 hours later, into the day on Tuesday, January 4th. It moves up into the Central Plains by late on the 4th. And that's when we start to see conditions improve in eastern and southeast Wyoming.
Because of bitter cold temperatures, the quality of the snow was unusual during the blizzard of '49.
It was a funny snow, real small, granulated, hard, wasn't any flakes to it, much more like, well, it was kind of like salt.
That snow was so hard. It was like cement. In fact, some places I understand they had to blast it out because it was so hard.
Accompanying the cold and the snow were fierce winds that seemed to never let up.
There was so much wind. That is what I remember the most, is the wind. It was so cold, and always the wind was blowing 24 hours a day. It just never stopped.
We found rocks up on top of the snow, and maybe it was half-inch, three-quarter-inch rocks that the wind had blown up on top of the snow. And that was what was so vicious about it.
When strong winds combine with snow, the smallest obstacle, a rock, shrub, tree, or fence, can be the start of a snowdrift. Drifting during the blizzard of '49 was monumental.
And there was this drift, it was probably 20 foot deep, right in the middle of the highway. It had just hit that snow fence and just went up and dropped. And there was this massive drift, I don't know, a couple 100 feet long, right there in the middle of the road.
One of the neighbors was snowed in in Lusk, and he walked home clearly north of Harrison. He remember sitting on the top of a telephone pole. It was that deep.
During the initial storm of January 2nd, state and county agencies that usually combated winter emergencies soon realized their equipment and capabilities weren't enough. The Wyoming Department of Transportation deployed snowplows as usual, but the roads kept redrifting as quickly as they were plowed. Wyoming Governor A.G. Crane declared a state of emergency. The Wyoming legislature created a state emergency relief board to combat the crippling effects of the storm. County relief boards, city and town disaster committees worked on a local level. By January 7th, WYDOT, National Guard, and county plows were finally making some headway against the drifts. But oftentimes they'd hit something solid, sometimes an abandoned car, or a frozen cow, a fence line or small outcropping. There was no telling what lay beneath the towering white blockades. Besides the wind, snow, and low temperatures, these storms also generated unique and weird phenomena.
So we had gotten up that morning to feed the cattle, and it was cloudy, and it just started lightning and thundering, and then it started snowing while we were out feeding the cattle.
I think one of the things that I remember the most about the storm, though, other than the severity of it, was the static electricity in the air. I'd never seen anything like it before or since. We had 6 guns and rifles hanging on our living room wall. They were all pointed the same direction. They were not pointed together. But there was a steady stream of sparks come out of those gun barrels for 3 days and 3 nights.
While we were shoveling snow, I happened to look up, and I turned around and told my dad, "Look up here what we have over our heads." And it was a perfect rainbow, with the exception of the fact that it was upside down and the points were up on either side, and the bow came down almost to the top of the snowdrifts.
Like that rainbow, the blizzard of '49 turned people's lives upside down as well. Those traveling home from the holidays in their automobiles were caught by surprise and stranded by the blizzard. Some pulled to the side of the road to sit out what they thought would be a short-lived squall. Others slid off the road into ditches or were stopped in their tracks by impassable drifts. There they sat, marooned for as long as 3 days. Some travelers carried extra blankets in their cars for emergencies. Others raided their suitcases and put on all the clothes they had. In desperation, some even ripped the stuffing from their car seats for added warmth. Many were without much in the way of food or water. As gas ran out and car heaters failed, their misery only increased.
The man was trapped in his car for 3 days. I think there was 2 or 3 other people in there with him. But he compared it to being in prison camp during World War II, and he said this was worse.
Other storm-imperiled motorists slowly made their way to roadside taverns, cafes, and filling stations. Rockport, Colorado was one such place.
Rockport, located about, I think, 15 miles south of Cheyenne, was a gas station and a nightclub, and they served food also, and a small facility.
365 people were stranded there by the storm, including 19 infants. People were sleeping on the floor, taking up every square inch of the tiny establishment. Kids were crying. Food was running out, and a makeshift latrine was set up in a utility room.
In addition to that, there was a Greyhound bus with all of their passengers. In this small facility, they were just jam-packed, and their conditions were miserable.
Eventually, supplies were parachuted in from Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and snowplows and tracked vehicles eventually reached the victims. Like those in Rockport, most stranded motorists were finally rescued, but a few didn't make it.
My aunt and uncle, they were visiting, they lived east of Rockport, about 4 or 5 miles, and they went to visit their neighbors, which was about 3.5 miles away, and they decided to start home, and it was Sunday afternoon. And they got about 3/4 of a mile from the house, and the pickup got stuck. And a lot of storms blow over, overnight. Well, they stayed, and then it got colder and colder, and so they decided that they'd start back. And they started walking back, and 2 neighbors survived the walk, and they said that my aunt and uncle were trying to hold up a blanket so the kids could walk behind it, and it just didn't work, and they went, and the kids couldn't make it. And when they found the bodies, well, my aunt was reaching down on her knee to get the little girl, and she froze in that position. My uncle was trying to hold up the boy, and they found him froze in that position.
For all the tragedy, suffering, and loss, the blizzard of '49 also had a lighter side. People often turned to humor to keep their spirits up.
Oh yes, after it was over, why, here came Edwin's dad and his older brother. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to scrub my floor. So of course I had the warming oven on the stove, and I put some water in a bucket and a mop in it, and I stuck it down to mop the floor, and the mop froze to the floor. So that ended that.
And they asked him why he was digging a hole in the top of the snowdrift, and he said, well, the last time he saw it, there was a windmill down there that needed oil, and he thought that was a good time to do it.
Yeah, they tell the story of a bunch of people were sitting around somewhere telling stories about the blizzard, This one bachelor, he kept saying, "We lost every chicken we had." And somebody else would tell another story, and yep, we lost every chicken we had. Finally, after about 3 or 4 times, somebody said, "Well, Hap, how many chickens did you have?" He said, "1."
During the blizzards, many Wyoming citizens unselfishly gave their time and resources to help those in need. The blizzard of '49 broke down social barriers and leveled the playing field. Rich and poor, city dwellers and ranchers, government workers and civilians alike came together to work for the good of all.
Everybody knew everybody. And no matter what happened, if they had trouble, hell, everybody pitched in and helped. It was good people.
They helped each other tremendously, you know. People that didn't have family or whatever would let, somebody stay there at their house, like the kids that were stuck in town, that were going to town school, that lived out on ranches and stuff. They'd open their house to them, and take care of them,
In one instance, in Goshen County, a fleet of vehicles carrying vital supplies from Torrington drove 30 miles into the northern part of the county, where people were in desperate need. 65 men with nothing more than snow shovels cleared the way during terrible weather conditions. They shoveled at the rate of 1 mile per hour, but they succeeded in their delivery. People driving back home would often come across cars that had slid off the road. They'd stop, pick up the passengers, and take them into their homes. Other times, people abandoned their vehicles and walked to nearby farmhouses, where they were taken in, fed, and provided with blankets and a place to sleep. Some homes were so crowded with storm refugees that they had to take turns sleeping, but none were turned away.
When somebody knocked at the door in the storm, there was no question but what you would take them in and do everything you could to make them comfortable.
But autos weren't the only conveyance in which people found themselves stranded. Trains, both steam locomotives and powerful diesels alike, simply couldn't move forward when huge drifts filled up cuts. Many froze to the tracks, waiting for help to arrive.
In the entire area, there were more than 50 trains stalled on the tracks with over 8,000 passengers aboard.
And the Burlington at Casper was snowbound. And there again, another situation in the Chicago Northwestern, east of Casper over toward Lusk, that was snowbound. And then further north up in Newcastle and Black Hills, that was snowbound. It just was a continual thing, and it cost the railroads millions of dollars, and millions in those days is a lot of money today.
Along its line, the Union Pacific mobilized rotary plows, V-plows, bulldozers, carryalls, and other equipment. Flamethrowers were used to thaw frozen trains. Thousands of employees devoted their time to fighting the tempests across the UP's lines. 5 died in the line of duty. In the first week of the storm, nearly 1,000 passengers were stranded on westbound trains, stalled in Hillsdale, Egbert, and Pine Bluffs, Wyoming, near the Nebraska border. Egbert was a town of 60 people, a whistle stop on the railroad between Pine Bluffs and Burns. Union Pacific employees melted snow to make coffee. Mothers with babies used towels and napkins for diapers. As supplies began to run low, a stalled freight train was raided for its cargo of eggs, ham, bacon, chicken, and lettuce. By Tuesday, the sub-zero cold froze the steam lines and disabled the heating system, dropping the in-car temperatures to 10 degrees above zero. The passengers were evacuated. Women and children were ushered into the nearby train depot to keep warm. Others trekked through 50-mile-per-hour winds and waist-high drifts to a schoolhouse 4 blocks away. Most weren't dressed for cold weather.
They didn't anticipate a terribly cold weather or a snowstorm. They just thought they were going from Chicago to San Francisco. It wasn't prepared for that.
On Wednesday, as the weather cleared, the passengers finally received some good news. Buses were coming to take them to Cheyenne. By noon the next day, they were aboard another train bound for the West Coast. Some stranded trains had to be dug out by hand before rotary plows could arrive and attack the drift.
We dug out the engine, shoveled and shoveled and shoveled, and a lot of the water we threw into the the snow we threw into the tender, and like has been said before, that was really pretty hard snow.
They were steam engines then, and they couldn't get her, so they went and I don't know where they found a great big rotary, and it was a big one mounted in the front of a steam engine. And they'd get into them cuts, and there'd be cattle in there froze, solid, and they'd tear up their big rotary. So they'd take her back to shed and patch it up. By the time they come back, they had to start all over again.
Although the blizzards created tremendous hardships for many people, it was a different story altogether for children. During periods of clearing, the world was transformed into a winter wonderland for kids.
Kids that were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old that just thought it was just the greatest time. They didn't have to go to school, and they could run out there and sled down these hills and throw snow around and never have to worry about going to school for 6 weeks. So it was a highlight in their education career, you might say.
The next day there was drifts everywhere, and you couldn't see from our house to the barn. It was just a scare. We could jump off the barn, and you could walk up on the drift and get on the barn and then jump off in the snow and just go right back up on the barn, you know.
Our farm was totally level as a tabletop. And it was the first time we had hills to sled on. Snowbanks close to 15, 16 feet deep, up the sides and clear over the roof of the barn, and crushed some of the timbers of the barn roof. And we played on that snowbank for the next 6 weeks with our sleds.
But as kids were having fun, ranchers were worried about being cut off by the storms and working harder than ever to dig out.
Our ranch house was essentially under an entire snowdrift, and so my dad had to shovel out these tunnels out of the front door, and of course you couldn't even see out of the windows, and so we were sort of like moles down in that hole of that house as we waited for my dad to shovel out the front door and get out to the front to the house.
We had to take the glass out of the storm door to get out on the doorstep to shovel the door open to get out of the house.
I don't think I ever want to shovel snow like that again. It drifted so badly that we would have to shovel out every door that we entered. The barn doors, the house door, all of those we would have to shovel out every morning. And then every evening when we did the chores, we had to shovel them out.
I always said that anyone who lived through the blizzard of '49, especially if they were out in the country, should never have to shovel another shovelful of snow in their lives. They had fulfilled their snow shoveling for life by the time they got through that storm.
Most farmers and ranchers had home canned and other food supplies stored for emergencies like blizzards.
Rural people do very well keeping themselves supplied with gasoline and groceries and supplies, and so we didn't suffer from that except where families took in extra people, and then that became a problem. But for the most part, the self-sufficiency of the families served them very well.
But some were stranded for so long that supplies and medicine did become an issue as the storms raged on.
My mother kept the records of the snow, and we were snowed in 9 weeks before anybody could go get out of there.
Those without telephone service relied on radio broadcasts for vital emergency information regarding the storms and the safety of loved ones. If they were in need, they were instructed to leave coded messages in the snow.
See, they made signs in the snow. They were given a code over the radio. If you needed food or if you needed something, you used the different codes.
The coded messages were cited and acted upon by a volunteer auxiliary of the Air Force, the Civil Air Patrol. These pilots flew food, fuel, and medical supplies to isolated families, completing thousands of missions, often in terrible weather conditions.
There were 2 pilots in Pine Bluffs making runs off of Highway 30 right downtown Pine Bluffs and delivering groceries.
They had people with private planes, but they would have ways of marking out there in the country, we need a doctor, or we need this medicine, or we need this food or whatever, and they would do airdrops in.
The amazing thing that I have found over the 49er blizzard was very few heart attacks. The people were used to shoveling manure, grain, hay, sand, whatever. We had strong hearts, and we could take it.
But there were medical emergencies. Appendicitis attacks, accidents, and other severe illnesses required immediate attention. In those instances, Civil Air Patrol planes equipped with skis flew in doctors to isolated areas and transported sick people or pregnant women to hospitals. On the ground, the Western States Telephone Company provided tracked vehicles that could negotiate the drifted terrain.
The sudden drop of the barometer caused every woman that was near to giving birth to think she was having her baby. And they did use the little weasel through the telephone company, and they did take a lot of women into the hospitals for their babies.
Besides food and medical support, staying warm indoors during the blizzards was a top priority. Farmers and ranchers relied on coal, gas, oil, and firewood. And if these began to run out, drastic measures were sometimes taken.
Some people ended up burning furniture to keep warm.
We did have an oil furnace, and so yeah, we were pretty good, but like you say, you just stayed in main rooms because you couldn't heat everything. You shut everything else off, and so you just stayed in small spaces.
The snow actually blowed through the cracks in the walls. I can remember, and when it was cold, you just couldn't keep the house warm. That old heater would be red, glowing hot, and you'd eat your meals standing around the heating stove in that old house. And there was an inch board and some hand-hewed shingles between us and 40 below, sleeping up in the loft of that old house.
One thing that made it bad was most houses were not insulated and built like they are today. I said a bushel full of snow would have come in a nail hole, and I believe that's right.
The poor insulation and weather resistance of old ranch and farmhouses led to other problems as well.
And the snow would blow through those wooden shingles and accumulate in the attics. And then, of course, having heat in the kitchen or in any of the rooms, then it would melt and ceilings would fall in.
But it wasn't just attics that filled with snow.
Barns filled up, granaries got snow through a keyhole, and a big old drift inside the granary, right through the keyhole. You couldn't believe how much snow could go through a keyhole.
As barns and outbuildings filled with snow, the animals housed in them, although protected from the direct blast of the storm, had other problems to contend with.
And these poor bulls, the wind kept blowing the snow in evidently, and they just kept packing it down and packing it down. And when we got there, there wasn't about an inch between their back and the roof of the building. They were all right, but man, I never saw anything like it.
But it was the livestock in the fields and pastures that suffered most from the blizzard of '49. Some cattle and sheep died standing in place from exposure or from suffocation. The fine snow froze in their noses and cut off their air supply. Others simply starved to death. Official estimates put Wyoming cattle loss at 55,000 head, and sheep at about 150,000. Other estimates projected that over 1 million cattle and sheep would be lost in the 4-state area. But stockmen considered all of these figures to be low.
I remember looking out the window and I thought, Jesus, here's an old boy made a sculpture out of a horse. And the road happened to go by, and it wasn't a statue, it was a horse. It was actually a horse, and it was frozen solid. And he was standing up, and there was cattle frozen, and sheep frozen, and even antelope.
I remember the cattle after the storm, their heads would be down, and there would be an icicle from their jaws, from their chin to the ground, and it was just a big, like, I said they were welded to the ground, and Dad would have to take an axe and chop them loose.
That is sad, I tell you. The livestock, they were helpless, just completely at the mercy of the storm, and they were just frozen right into their tracks. And you can't get to them to help. It was sad to see them. It was a great loss.
The situation was getting desperate. To get feed to starving cattle and sheep, the Air Force launched Operation Haylift. C-45 and C-47 cargo planes were loaded with tons of hay, feed, and other supplies and flown into cities like Casper, Cheyenne, and Rawlins. The provisions were then moved to outlying farms and ranches, sometimes by snow-busting convoys. In really inaccessible areas, the hay was dropped directly onto the range as close to the snowbound livestock as possible. In addition to the military flight crew on each mission, there were several civilians. A spotter was someone familiar with the area who guided the pilot to the animals in need. Then there were the kickers, other locals whose job it was to shove the hay out of the open cargo doors of the aircraft.
We did anywhere from 4 to 8 or 9 flights a day, depending on how fast, we could get the hay, to the plane. We'd fly over where we were supposed to drop the hay out. We'd get our hay hooks and start throwing them out one at a time. Well, it took a long time to do it, and we missed the target most of the time. But we figured out a method that we had did basically the same thing, but we made a big slide. So when we got where we wanted to drop the hay, the pilot would just head up and all the hay come tumbling out all by itself. So we were able to really dump a lot of hay real quick that way and make a lot more trips.
These operations could be hazardous. The planes often flew over rugged mountains, then dove low to get the feed close to the animals. The threat of free-falling hay bales damaging the aircraft was ever present. Once dropped, the tightly pressed bales frequently burst like bombs when they hit the ground. The loose hay scattered, ready for feeding. There were mishaps, but no serious accidents. One rancher who asked that a bale be dropped as close to his house as possible was aghast when it crashed through the roof of his front porch. Not everyone was convinced the hay lift flights were useful. Some thought the vast number of cattle and sheep needing feed made airdrops impractical compared to ground-based operations. But the flights did help as a temporary measure, getting food to inaccessible livestock that were in critical shape. It kept them alive until they could be fed normally. Operation Haylift was repeated many times across Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas during the blizzard of '49. Some 2 million cattle and sheep received hay from the air. Among all the residents of the Upper Plain states, some of the hardest hit during the blizzard were Native Americans, both on and off reservations. Indian life in the late 1940s was tough, without much material security. This was exacerbated by the blizzard. At the request of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Red Cross delivered food and supplies when roads were blocked or when reservations had insufficient funds to meet the emergency situation. Indians living off the reservation suffered as well. Some lived in tents, burning old tires and railroad ties to stay warm. They sometimes ate blizzard-killed beef, despite the possibility that the meat might be toxic.
They were pretty destitute people. You know, they didn't have much of anything. Imagine living in, some of them lived in just a canvas tent during that 49 blizzard.
But I heard from more than one source that the Indian reservation up in South Dakota was one of the last areas to be cleared. And one party told me it was almost April 1st before they got in there.
It wasn't just outlying farms and ranches and Indian reservations that were impacted and isolated by the storms. Cities as big as Cheyenne and towns as small as Lusk were drifted over with snow. Hotels and restaurants were crowded with stranded travelers. Because of closed transportation corridors, emergency food supplies, as well as those on grocery store shelves, began running low.
The one aspect that's interesting about the small towns is that Wyoming in those days was very well served generally by railroad, and not only as passenger trains, but also most of the supplies that were brought into these towns came by rail.
We got most of our groceries and stuff by railroad. And there wasn't a railroad train in here for 13 and a half days.
The stores were out of products, you know, like meat and, normal stuff. Milk and eggs and stuff like that, they were out of them. Pretty bare pickings in the stores.
It got so bad in Rawlins that the bars were not selling packaged goods because they wanted to keep what liquor they could for their shots, for their regular drinks. That's bad.
Rawlins escaped the first storm of January 2nd with only 3 inches of snow. A short time later, all that changed.
We had passenger trains stranded in Rawlins. First time, 250 passengers, and the last time, 650. At one time, the Red Cross was feeding 1,700 meals a day for stranded passengers and otherwise.
6-foot drifts on Highway 287 were reported on January 18th with a temperature of 22 degrees below zero. A new onslaught of snow hit on January 23rd. Then, on February 6th, yet another blast.
The houses on the south side of Rawlins, several of them, were covered entirely, and they had to evacuate the people and lodge them elsewhere. On the west end, where the highway went through, it drifted into the Ideal Motel, I would say up to the eaves of the tourist cabins.
Railroad service between Rawlins and Laramie finally resumed after almost 2 weeks of inactivity. It was then that Rawlins received its first carload of mail in 12 days. In Lusk, drifts piled up 12 to 13 feet high. Outside of town, they approached 30 feet. A drift towering over a highway patrol car puts it all into perspective.
Well, that same patrolman was standing on that 49 Ford car with his hands stretched up in the air. He was at least 6 foot tall himself, and those drifts were several times taller than he was. There was drifts 20 to 30 feet deep, really, on the highway and the railroad.
Main Street Lusk businesses were nearly inaccessible.
I recall going out and
climbing on a pile of snow that was out in the yard. It was like ice. And so I could see up and down Main Street to see what it looked like. Snow, just snow. Everything was covered. You didn't see any buildings at all. No cars moving. No, the cars were all covered with snow and would be for quite a while.
450 persons were stranded in Lusk, filling the local hotels and tourist courts. Discovering this, Lusk citizens voluntarily called the hotels, offering to share their homes with the marooned. Casper received only 8 to 10 inches of snow during the first blizzard, but it was cut off from the south and east by snow-clogged roads. The State Highway Department in Casper reported that snowplows sent out Monday on the highways to Douglas and Midwest were lost. Additional plows were dispatched to locate the men and their vehicles, but they too failed to report back. Finally, on Wednesday, all were accounted for, some spending the time in their vehicles, others taken in at ranches. Also on that Wednesday, Casper's little airlift began. Light planes took off from Wardell Field to search the area for herds of lost sheep and cattle. A reporter flew up with them to take pictures. When they were developed, his editor thought there was something wrong with the camera. All that could be seen were fields of white. Those who could reach Cheyenne by train or automobile packed the hotels. Others were housed in the Naval Reserve Armory, which was turned into a dormitory for stranded travelers. The initial January storm dumped an estimated 20 to 30 inches of snow on the city. Drifts piled high from winds gusting to nearly 60 miles per hour. Over the next few weeks, Cheyenne slowly dug out. On Monday, January 3rd, Laramie seemed to have escaped the severe storm, but by Tuesday, January 4th, the city was bogged down in drifts. All roads were closed in the Laramie area. No rail, bus, or highway traffic was moving. The University of Wyoming halted registration activities for the winter term.
What's extraordinary about it is that the University of Wyoming almost never closes down. There has to be really a pretty monumental event, snow event for UW to cancel a class, and yet it did so frequently during January and early February of 1949.
The blizzard of '49 not only had a significant impact on humans and livestock, wildlife suffered too. Although adapted to normal winter conditions, Wyoming's hoofed and feathered creatures had a hard time coping with this most abnormal winter.
December '48 was much tougher than usual, both temperature-wise and snow, and so deer and antelope were in tougher condition going into January and when the big blizzard hit.
Deer fatalities were heavy, especially in the upper Platte River country. With the storms covering much of the natural forage in the state, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department initiated an emergency feeding program.
We found out it was a little trickier than usual. We thought we would, just herd them to it and then they'd just start lapping up the feed. Well, it wasn't the case. It seemed like the stress from the herding took away their appetites. We actually observed higher mortality with fed deer than corresponding deer that were on natural range.
Before the blizzard, we had a pretty good population of pheasants, and there wasn't hardly a pheasant left. They couldn't survive it. They were buried too long.
Up in the area around Hawk Springs, it was really noted for good pheasant hunting, and that after this blizzard, it wiped out the pheasants.
Pheasants in Goshen and Platte counties were hit hard, Also, though, the nesting and brooding conditions that year were excellent, so that helped the pheasant population bounce back.
But among all of Wyoming's wildlife, it was the antelope that really fared the worst during the blizzard of '49.
With those bad conditions of December '48, we had already seen more pronghorn coming down and hanging out around highways, particularly US 30 and also, the main UP line. There had already been more animals than, more pronghorn than usual, escaping the snow along those corridors. So it really got worse after the blizzard hit. Quoting the 1949 annual report, red desert antelope were all but annihilated is the term they used. They say that 1,800 antelope were killed on the UP main line during the 1949 winter from trains.
Out of all of the wildlife, only the elk made it through the winter without significant loss. Old records for wind, cold, and snow were falling like dominoes. Storm after storm lashed the area. No one had ever experienced this much severe winter weather for so long. Governors of the affected states began asking for federal help. On January 29, 1949, President Truman declared the region a major disaster area. He commanded Major General Lewis Pick of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to spearhead Operation Snowbound.
President Truman gave Major General Pick a blank check and told him to dig out the West, and that they did. Army, Navy, Air Force, National Guard, private contractors came in with thousands of pieces of equipment to open roads and rescue people.
Convoys of trucks, usually following a bulldozer. They went north, south, east, and west.
From command headquarters in Omaha, General Pick described the work of Operation Snowbound in the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Wyoming as the greatest bulldozer operation ever organized. Operation Snowbound had three major objectives. 1. Relieve human adversity and suffering. 2. Clear ice and snow from rails and roads to open supply channels. 3. Conserve livestock. Speedy coordination and implementation was a high priority of Operation Snowbound. The four-state theater of operations totaled 193,000 square miles of land, about the size of Spain. The far-flung military and civilian units needed to organize, mobilize, and follow through fast. Any delay would mean more livestock damage, continued human suffering, and the possible loss of life. The resources of each state were integrated into the Army program. State, county, and local disaster committees provided Army officers with maps and guides familiar with the area. The Red Cross furnished food, clothing, medicine, and medical care. State highway departments, civil air patrols, highway patrols, and National Guards all worked together with the Army and the Air Force to combat the effects of the storms. They were assisted by agricultural organizations, civic groups, medical societies, veterinarians, and news organizations. Private contractors were also a big part of the operation with their bulldozers, snowplows, and manpower under contract with the military. Army Weasels, M29 tracked cargo carriers, ran atop the snow to bring supplies and assistance to storm-bound residents. Following up the Weasels were mobile strike forces made up of bulldozers, snowplows, fuel trucks, wreckers, tractors, and cargo vehicles. But sometimes even these weren't enough. At one point, a Sherman tank was dispatched from Green River to rescue a sick Union Pacific employee at an isolated pumping station. Those in the field faced hazardous conditions. Incessant high winds blew granular snow and splinters of ice, cutting faces and visibility. Extreme cold caused frostbite. The glare of the snow led to snow blindness. One soldier and 6 civilians died during their involvement with Operation Snowbound. By February 19th, the last of the great storms had rolled through the upper plain states and the weather began to improve. Now, Operation Snowbound could work at full capacity, unhindered by severe weather. The mission that began under presidential order on January 29, 1949, ended some 45 days later on March 15th. By all measures, Operation Snowbound had been a resounding success. In Wyoming, over 4,000 people received federal aid. Nearly 1,000 Wyoming ranches were assisted in some fashion. Snow-moving equipment logged over 18,000 machine hours and 139,000 man-hours, opening thousands of miles of Wyoming roads and feed lanes. Almost 28,000 tons of food, fuel, and feed were hauled over these pathways. But after the storms, there was still more to be done.
There was a lot of work. There was certainly a lot of buildings, too, that had been damaged by the heavy weight of the snow or by the wind. So there were sheds and other outbuildings at ranches that had to be repaired. So it was a costly cleanup over a rather lengthy period of time. And so when you totaled up all the economic costs, you have to take that into account as well. It was not just all of the delays from the blizzard stopping off traffic, but it was also the cost of repairing things after the blizzard was long gone.
By the time it was all over, Wyoming was left reeling from the blizzard's punch. In their wake, the storms dumped an economic catastrophe on the state estimated at $9 million, roughly $90 million in today's currency. General Pick estimated the overall cost to the Operation Snowbound area at $190 million. As the weather cleared and the temperatures warmed, there was fear of massive flooding in many parts of the state prone to this. In addition to the snow that still lay on the ground, there were huge accumulations in the mountains as well. But in Wyoming, spring thawing occurred very gradually, and the massive snowbanks were slow to melt.
One of the last things that we ever hear of the winter of '49 was in September, many months afterwards, that they were digging a line and they found a snowdrift still there under a layer of cinders. And in it, they found a well-preserved frozen hog in September.
The rushing streams and full reservoirs provided the state with the largest amount of irrigation water it had seen in years. In many places, it was a green spring, a productive summer, and a bountiful fall. And so the winter of 1949 ended on a positive note. But the memories of that epic event would never be forgotten.
I know they've had winters since and everything and blizzards, but believe me, it was nothing like '49.
Comparing the 1949 blizzard with all of the subsequent storms that we've had, and they've been many, and I've observed them, there's nothing that compared with the 1949 blizzard.
It was. Unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and I hope I never see anything like it again.
We've had winters where we had big storms, but they weren't as big as that, they weren't as cold as that, and they didn't last as long.
This was so blistering cold that it suffocated you. It suffocated the livestock. You couldn't do anything in it. You couldn't see. You couldn't keep from slip sliding or running into snowbanks. It just was totally miserable.
We'll always remember that storm. It stands out among all the other storms that we've had. And we managed to live through it, thank the Lord. But no, we're Wyomingites, we can take it.
In the final tally, 17 Wyoming residents died in the storms. The official toll for the entire region was 76 fatalities. Some were not found until the drifts began melting. But for all the tragedy and loss, suffering and death, there was also hope and heroism, unselfish sacrifice, and generosity. The blizzard, for the most part, brought out the best in people. By working together to overcome sometimes seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the storm of the century was ultimately defeated.
Now the old folks say that back in 1949 was a long cold storm when the sun refused to shine. The snow so deep and thick as London fog, you could step over phone lines like you'd step over a log. But people in the houses buried deep beneath the snow dug tunnels from their doorways, up and out they had to go.
Production for Storm of the Century, The Blizzard of '49 was supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources, by Rocky Mountain Power, a division of PacifiCorp, and by the Wheeler Family Foundation, with partial funding by the Wyoming Humanities Council, by Rose Brothers Incorporated of Lingle, Wyoming, by the Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, and by the members of Wyoming PBS. Thank you.
Storm of the Century, The Blizzard of '49 is available on DVD for $30. To order, go to shop.wyomingpbs.org.